Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Kevin Ruth. He is the Executive Director of NJAIS. And, before Kevin took that role, he did a lot of work with schools on a topic that I'm hearing a lot more about these days, and that is mergers and acquisition. It just seems like this is a conversation that, has been emerging over the last 5, 6 years. And certainly you're seeing it on the higher ed level. I just looked to Northeastern and the way they've been merging with schools, college campuses across the country to extend their footprint. So when Kevin and I had spoke about this, I said, this would be a great podcast episode. And Kevin is here today to kind of break down what do mergers mean on the for independent schools, kind of an anatomy of the independent school mergers. It's going to be a really good conversation to help schools understand the process, what's involved, all of the things. But before we get there, Kevin, Ruth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here, Peter. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too, my friend. Me too. And we're going to get to it in just a second. But before we do that, can you introduce yourself and NJAIS?
Sure. So the New Jersey Association of Independent Schools is approximately 90 schools and growing. We serve schools in a handful of ways. Number one is accreditation. So we are an accrediting body. Another is our legislative advocacy and advisory work. There's a lot going on between federal and state levels of legislation right now, lots of activity. We provide robust professional learning opportunities, and we have some services that we do for schools, such as board chair coaching, head of school coaching, and some other items. So that's, holistically, there are a number of associations like this across the country. We are recognized by ICASA, the International Council Advancing in Independent School Accreditation.
And tell me a little bit more about your background, because I think it's so interesting.
Yeah, so I worked in independent schools for a number of years, almost 20 years, and then rose up through the ranks, so to speak, to assistant head. I was at Tower Hill School in Delaware, and then went off to be executive director of a very large international K-12 International Schools Association called ECIS, which at the time was European Council of International Schools, and then we renamed and rebranded to the Educational Collaborative for International Schools, and we had over 400 member schools in about 90 countries. So I had a great opportunity to see, quote unquote, how we do school in lots of different environments, and not just US oriented schools, but really everything under the sun. Then was really privileged to lead a fully online proprietary graduate school of education, standalone university, but it was just a graduate school of ed. And I was brought in to clean up operations so that we could sell that, because the founder needed a succession plan. She was about to turn 80. Extraordinary woman.
Hmm.
And that's really when I got in deeply into merger and acquisition, because I was on the due diligence side. I worked with potential buyers. We ran a whole private auction for this. Became really enamored of it. And subsequent to that, took a course to become a certified merger and acquisition advisor. There's an exam and all that other good stuff at the end of that. And I've just kind of fallen in love with that space. As a nerd, I find it academically really interesting. And then there's the practice side of things, which, having been a consultant for a couple of years before I started at NJAIS, I did this work, but I also just studied what was happening, certainly in higher education, which you referred to with Northeastern earlier, but also just across different kinds of industries, recognizing that there's a dearth of information around nonprofit mergers.
Yeah.
And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, and I've had the good fortune to talk to a number of schools um, about opportunities in that space.
Yeah. So what I'd love to do is kind of define, what do we mean by M&A in the independent school context? Because I know technically it's not an acquisition, but I'd love to, all right, let's level set. What does that mean for us in our world?
Yeah, I mean, M&A it's shorthand. That's the best way to describe it. It's shorthand. And it works. And yes, it does stand in the singular for merger and acquisition, although we usually tend to pluralize it, which is fine too. Uh, but a really important thing to understand up front is, when we normally, as consumers of media, when we hear about M&A activity in industries, what we don't necessarily read about is that these are for-profit companies There are stockholders involved. It's a stock transaction. It could be cash. It could have a number of other things, but nonprofit schools aren't stock bearing corporations. So fundamentally, it's really about an asset transfer from institution A to institution B. So it's fundamentally about that asset transfer. Merger. So the words are important, M
Yeah.
and A. Okay. So merger is I think the best word to describe what we're talking about when two institutions come together, when they consolidate. So the C word is something we will often use and hear, consolidation. I also think it's the best term because even when schools are disparate, which could be in size, could be in financial resources, could be other things, the recommended positioning on this is really come to the table from a position of equity. Even if one is bigger than the other in some way, shape, or form, you're doing this together. It's a collaboration. So I think merger is really the best word. There is absolutely an argument to be made that sometimes it's an acquisition. And that often happens in what we might term, to use a slightly antiquated phrase, but I think most listeners will know it, a shotgun wedding.
Hmm.
And what happens in a shotgun wedding is traditionally there is a school in severe financial distress, severe. And that school tends to have waited until kind of the last minute to try to come up with a solution. And there might be another school in the market that is willing to merge with that school, but everyone sees it as an acquisition. And there's nothing wrong with that framework, but we would still do better, I think, to just refer to it as a merger.
Yeah. What are the most common types of mergers that you see in schools? I mean, you talked about the shotgun wedding. Maybe it's two peer schools coming together, knowing that they're better together. Maybe you're merging. I don't know. I'm just curious. Like, what do you see out there?
So the evidence base around this is not as robust as it could be. We know that mergers have happened in the independent school landscape over the last X number of years. It's
I
actually
mean, the 70s, right? I mean, there are tons of mergers there.
there was a really heightened period of activity, certainly then, and there have continued to be mergers all along. But I think what we are missing is a good analytical evidence base, real studies as to what led to those, what did, without divulging certain details, what did negotiations look like, and then what did the quote unquote final product, what did the merged entity end up succeeding in doing that the institutions could not have done by themselves separately.
Yeah.
So whether that's a potential eventually funded study by E.E. Ford or somebody else, I think there's something there. So backing away from that, I would say in my own sphere of knowledge and sometimes personal experience around this, it's a variety of things. Again, merger is just kind of the loose term that we use to look at this. When schools come together, like a merger is a merger. So I probably wouldn't call something a full merger. If it's a merger, it is a merger.
It's a merger. Yeah.
The question is, culturally, what kind of merger is it? So is it entity A and entity B, and one gets assimilated into the other? So is it an assimilation in nature? Is it almost like a Venn diagram with two circles coming together? We have a little special space in between. Is it a coming together in a collaborative kind of merger, which is more traditionally what you would see if something like a pre-K to 8 and 9 to 12 came together?
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Or something that happens quite rarely, or at least it could happen rarely. I'm not sure that I personally have firsthand knowledge of when this would have occurred, but it can, when A and B come together and they form C. They just form something totally new. It's the kind of 1
Mhm.
plus 1 equals 3 mentality.
Yeah.
This is something totally unique. Those are the kinds of mergers that can happen. There are alternatives to merger that may even take place beforehand, or a school may not think about them. We could talk about those as well, but those aren't mergers.
Yeah. That's a really good point because I'm thinking back to an episode that I recorded with the leadership at Steamboat Mountain School. And so there's an example of a K-8 and a high school coming together
Mhm.
to merge. But where the conversation started, and this is what I found so fascinating about that conversation, it started at hey, can we share services? Can we have like a shared CFO? And then as they got deeper into the conversation or into the to work, they're like, maybe there's something else here. So I guess the question that I have for you is, at what point does that kind of potential partnership stop being a partnership and now all of a sudden you're having a merger conversation?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a specific answer to that, but I think the pathway of shared services is a really interesting and fruitful one. It starts off because 2 schools have a very common need, and maybe they have just a part-time need from each school. And then obviously once item A, so if it's a shared CFO, for example, once item A starts to work and the 2 schools realize that, oh, there's actually more that we could be doing beyond just this, because that person who's uniquely positioned to see this is going to begin picking up on other weak or strong signals that the two institutions, excuse me, might want to think further about. So that really, really works. And it solves a short-term problem. And I think it actually buys more time in all the best ways that that expression could be used. It buys time to be really measured and considered as to how best to come together. And the institutions may choose not to, and that's
Yeah.
okay too, if the shared services arrangement works.
I love the idea of shared services because I mean, it's kind of like you get to date before you get married, right? So, you get to kind of see, oh, what are they about? What are we about? And all of a sudden you can begin to identify whether it's intentional or just you just kind of absorb it and feel it, but like culturally, how do we overlap? Are our missions consistent with one another? I mean, it's really I appreciate it because it's a chance to get to know each other in a different kind of way than if you're just 2 schools in the same town.
Mhm. Well, and one thing I'd want to underscore too, in talking about the nature of different mergers, such
Yeah.
as assimilation and collaboration melding together for that perfect Venn diagram middle, that's a really important considerations for boards and school leaders to think about early on, even if there's not a bona fide merger discussion yet, but you're thinking about it as an institution. You really should be asking yourselves culturally, what would we be willing to entertain?
Yeah.
Would we want to be absorbed or assumed into another entity? Like, how would that feel? If we had to, because of circumstances, usually financial, which is enrollment and revenue are going together here,
Yep.
then to what degree might we find it acceptable? Under what kinds of circumstances? Those are great conversations to have at the strategic generative level with the board, so that if a conversation has to occur, like you have to force it to occur because you need to, or by happenstance, if it occurs, you already have a certain anchor in the ground related to the identity of the school and the mission and so forth about what is within the spectrum, like what's acceptable, where would we ideally like to be. And
Yeah.
that's helpful because you're not on the back foot if you're forced into a conversation about a merger where you're constantly pedaling going, oh my goodness, didn't think about this, and then you feel a bit buffeted, and
So
you
that
may not be your
actually
best self.
yeah, and it kind of prompts a question for me, which is h how does the process usually unfold? Before you even get to closing on the merger, like, what are some of the stages in which school boards and leadership need to go through in order to do this well?
So I don't want to call it a formula. There's a textbook pathway,
Okay.
but as we know, as as independent school educators, there's what the textbook says, and then there's what happens in reality. And they're not necessarily dissociated, but they're kind of variations on a theme. So I think it's helpful to have a textbook definition in front. And I won't necessarily go through all the pieces, but there are around 10 steps to this from start to finish. But loosely speaking, we've already begun to address kind of the front end of it, which is recognition of what might be. So might it be necessary to do this? Whether because of being forced into it, for example, financial distress, or is it truly strategic opportunity, which I think we don't talk enough about, actually, that there are great reasons for schools to be thinking about coming together that have nothing to do with what we always hear about, which is financial distress.
Mm.
Um, and then if so, if there are good conversations about, well, what would we hypothetically bring to the table? What do we bring to the table? Is it a distinctive program? Is it a particular division that's powerful? Is it a function like we've got awesome college guidance or secondary school placement? Whatever that might be, what strengths do we bring? And then how might we parlay that into contributing to a stronger and better whole? That is really important. You've got to have that conversation up front, because then ideally what you would do, if as a school you wanted to be really intentional about this, is you would produce, and this has some various names. I'm going to call it a CIM, a confidential information memorandum.
Hmm.
Call it a prospectus, if you will.
Yeah.
Here's our school profile, but from an M&A perspective. A little bit of history, signature strengths. Why are we looking? What are we looking for? Just to have something there. You may not use that CIM in its original form, but at least you've got something, so that if you have the opportunity to kind of solicit interest, you have something tangible to give the other party as a means of starting a conversation. Or if you don't use it, you've got it mentally. You know what the
Yeah.
talking points are.
That's right. Right. And that makes total sense to me. And so do both sides do that, or is it just really the side that's soliciting interest, do you think?
Well, again, I think it depends on circumstance, right? And so I think if your institution is in a position whereby you need to solicit what I would call, like, undertake a private auction, you need to find a quote unquote buyer, you need to find a merger partner, and you may be in the inferior position because of circumstance. It's really important that you do have something like that together, because the burden will be on you to articulate why you're looking and what you need out of that, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
You'll need to know your financials inside and out. You really need to have a comprehensive understanding. If it's two schools that strategically are already in decent to really strong places and are simply looking at, there's opportunity here to align because we're close philosophically and programmatically and so forth, it's probably unlikely that you're going to start off with preparing something like a CIM, but sooner rather than later, if you're talking, you'll need to kind of stake out your positions and what you're bringing to the table. So the same thing happens. It's just a different timeline and from different places.
Right. You've got to map your strategic advantage together, right?
Absolutely. And that's the word. So there's an overall thing that we call a strategic rationale. Beautifully, it would be one sentence.
Hmm.
What is the strategic rationale for these two institutions to come together? Now, you wouldn't put that in a CIM, but once you've dealt with the CIM, and let's say that you've gone out, you've talked to, I'm making this up, 3 to 5 potential partner schools, and then there's one with whom you think you would have the most synergy and the best odds for success. Then after you sort of get into whatever your legal agreement, and I'm not talking the transaction, I'm not talking about the deal, but
Yeah.
uh, from non-disclosure agreement to potentially a letter of intent, you need to define at that point, what is the strategic rationale? Because I
Yeah.
wouldn't sign an LOI unless
Yeah.
I knew what the strategic rationale was. Both sides would have to agree on it. Otherwise, you'd be doing an awful lot of work without having had that core conversation.
You know, it reminds me of a podcast episode that I heard hosted by Jeff Salingo, who I'm sure many of you know, writes about higher ed, covers higher ed, author, and Michael Horn, right? And they host this higher ed podcast. I don't know if it comes out weekly or not, but they had the M&A person from Northeastern on, and they got into this. And one of the questions, and when they were talking about, like, how do you identify partners, right? Merger partners. And um, she has this, like, great clarifying question that they have to answer up front, which is, what can we do together that we can't do alone?
Exactly.
And I was like, oh, that makes like that makes so much sense to me. Like, yeah, how are we better together? Or, you know, and if you can't clarify that strategic rationale, then, you know, I could see that it's probably going to be a lot of work for not much gain.
Yeah. Because in short shrift, here's what happens if you don't identify that and you sign an LOI. Suddenly, legally, operationally, whatever, you're deep in due diligence, working on a lot of stuff. It's really important stuff. You have to work on it, but you might, to go back to the wedding analogy, you might be walking down the aisle, and then suddenly you get up to the front and you're like, wait a minute, what? why are we here? I know we ran all the numbers and it looks like the model works and so forth, but oh, wait a minute. We don't agree on some fundamental
Right.
philosophical principles here.
Yikes.
This is I mentioned it earlier, that position of equity coming together from that position. If we're not there, that can fall apart really quickly. And you've just done all of this work from which you will have learned a lot, mind you,
Yeah.
but it won't end up resulting in really where you need to go.
Yeah. Well, let's imagine that, two schools come together, they do that work, they're like, we're better together, the merger happens. What happens next?
Legal counsel, legal counsel, legal counsel.
Yeah,
You need legal counsel because they tend to have, or they're always going to have, if you're really serious about merger, they're going to have a checklist, and it's a due diligence checklist, and it exists for any host of reasons. Um, some of the more obvious ones, you'll need to make sure that you've brought this to the attention of your accrediting body, because they can be a helpful partner in supporting you and recognizing the kind of the teleology of this. Where's it going, and what kinds of things would you have to have if it comes to fruition?
yeah,
When would you have another visit as a new entity? You have to start planning for that operationally, like classic backward by design curriculum mapping, and then just start mapping back. So you do need to know that.
yeah.
Council will also point out, do you need to have state attorney general clearance? Is there some sort of regulatory piece? And we've got 51 different states for education purposes, because DC counts as its own state for purposes of education, and it is not cookie cutter. And so you need local legal counsel in your jurisdiction to make sure you've got that right. And then lots of other things like, does either school have any pending lawsuits? Anything still alive? Was anything recent? Are you still paying out? That sounds quite crass, but it's true, because the schools together need to understand, they have to have complete transparency and understand what all of the inputs to this model are. And there's a whole host of things to walk through, but some of the more important ones that should come up early on, possibly even before signing an LOI, are things like, what would the new board look like?
Yeah, sure, right?
Right?
Who's the new head?
Get X number of seats? Is it an equal number of seats? Is it just
Yeah.
a number of seats? How does that work? What do we do about our endowed funds, if we have endowed funds? What about faculty contracts? There are those pieces need to be talked about sooner rather than later. But once you involve legal counsel, then there is going to be an analysis of what exists, and then how could those be not merged? That, like the contracts, that's a really good example. Honored. How are they going to be honored? Because it also depends, when in the year is this happening? If it's happening right now, faculty contracts are about to come out, and if the hypothetical merger would take place, let's say July 1 or onward, there is not going to be time to issue a whole separate set of contracts after the deal closes, which may not close until, say, April or May.
Right. Takes
So
time.
both schools are going to have to issue contracts, and there's going to have to be an agreement of honoring the contract. What about the benefit structure? What about tuition remission? All of these pieces, they can be dealt with and overcome, but you can begin to see, just from those few examples, the necessity of beginning to map this out early, so that you can then do due diligence with legal counsel's guidance and so forth. And then you have to do a whole operational mapping exercise as to, how do we come together. The deal might close, but just because the deal closes doesn't mean everything is perfect.
Right.
Integration takes time.
So if I'm hearing this correctly, like as you're doing that due diligence and you're starting to go through this process of all the things that you just laid out, right? In essence, what you're doing is building an implementation plan so that when the merger closes, now you're a single entity. Then you start to put this implementation plan into place.
Yeah. You don't start before.
You don't start before,
You
right?
map it out, but
Right.
until the ink is dry,
Yeah.
you don't do it, because it's unnecessary work and you don't want to have to walk it back.
How do boards manage the difficult question of who's going to be the head of school?
Well, the answer is, there's not one way.
Okay.
That's the absolute honest answer. It's, again, that's another critical question up front, just like, what's the board look like, the composition, the number of seats, etc. Um, the best case scenario, and this happens more often than not, is in one of the two institutions, one of the heads is leaving. Now, that could be retirement, that could be resignation, that could be whatever the reasons are. That's the most helpful scenario because then the discussion doesn't have to be fraught, potentially fraught. Um, if you're looking at two strategically strong and independent schools already that are thinking of coming together, then it's definitely more difficult. And the board's really a subset of the board. What would make sense the most often is probably the officers, but it really could just be a designated subset, ideally with the board chair for both sides. Um, is what would have to be true for the person, a person, just a hypothetical person, to lead new entity? What has to be true? So if it's a K-8 becoming a K-12, what would have to be true? Um, Starting with those kinds of questions. And frequently what does happen, at least conversationally, sometimes in practice, is what I would call the easy road. And I don't mean that it's simple. I mean that the cognitive load is eased by saying, let's just have co-heads,
Yeah.
you know. Now that can be, I underscore can be a working model. I won't say working model. That can be a model. It may or may not work.
Right.
It would have to be very clearly delineated as to what head A does and head B does. Some schools have done that where one's purely internal, one's purely external, but there are those things that come into a gray zone and then they have to be brought to the board. And then there's potentially more complex than usual decision making that has to occur. And then depending on what that composition of the new board looks like, if there's a disproportionate number of seats for one school over the other, right? Hypothetically, it's not supposed to, but hypothetically that could weigh it one way or the other. I referred to evidence bases before about mergers. The same is actually true of co-head models. The evidence base around it, like really robustly researched and against some norms, there's not really anything reliable out there. So there is no way to look at the concept of co-head and say X, Y, and Z definitely work, A, B, and C don't.
Yeah, what's interesting though is that you can look to the for-profit space and start to see how co-CEOs are functioning together. I've certainly, I just listen, I mean, you can tell I'm a big fan of podcasts, right? I've listened to multiple pods where they've talked about co-CEOs, and it gets to what you mentioned earlier. You just have to be super clear about who owns what. And when there is a gray area, what is the decision-making progress to get to an answer, right?
Yeah, and there's a little caveat in an agreement whereby there's a co-head relationship. There's almost always, there should be a clause that says in the event that person A or person B leaves,
Yeah.
there's an opportunity to decide, do we just consolidate to one head?
Sure, 100%.
Right.
Absolutely.
And
That makes
that when
sense.
you look at co-head models, that tends to be what happens. One leaves, they consolidate.
Yeah. Hey, I'm curious. I'm going to backtrack just for a second here,
Yep.
but if a school was starting to think about, a merger, what are the legal and fiduciary obligations for board members? Like, what should they understand as they head into this?
Read your bylaws, read your bylaws, read your bylaws. So pretty much, I've not seen bylaws without this yet, but there will be a clause within the bylaws where it is explicit and it is unambiguous about the fiduciary responsibility of trustees. And it's also usually accompanied by something like a 2/3 vote. And the board may have simple majority for other votes, but for certain things like real estate transactions, merger and acquisition, and a few others, it tends to be somewhere around a 2/3 majority. And the trustees have to do due diligence and follow what I would call the prudent person rule, so that if there's a joint task force between the two schools, whatever, all of the work that gets done, the hat that has to be on is there are many hats, but really the focus is on what would a prudent person do under similar circumstances. And if you use that as your North Star as a board member, you're really not going to stray. And when you don't know something, you identify that you don't know and you seek out help. Now that could be a third party to help. It might be legal counsel. It might be your bank. This also depends a lot on whether one or both institutions have, if you're carrying debt, What are the debt covenant requirements? What does the bank say about its sign off on merger, acquisition, et cetera? So again, prudent person would make sure legal, financial, anything like that is covered. It has to be exhaustive.
Yeah.
A lot of risk management.
A lot of risk management. As schools are looking at it, like what at the concept of merger, what are the myths that are out there that they should be aware of and maybe dispel?
That's a solid question. There are probably a lot of them. Have I heard them articulated identically? Probably not. I think one is that it happens quickly. So, and I think this is what we see when I referred to, the shotgun weddings beforehand, is a school, and really with the best of intentions, but former Latin teacher, out of ignorance, from meaning just not to know, not knowing, good intentions, but not knowing. They wait, right? The can gets kicked down the road, and suddenly they realize they may not have enough money to make payroll through the end of the year, and it might be April.
Yeah.
This definitely has happened multiple times.
Oh, I can think of a handful of
And
examples.
and suddenly the school's like, "Oh, we need a merger partner." But based on what we've talked about here today, you can begin to understand that the machinations of planning involved to pull this off successfully for both parties merits time, consideration, reflection. And to be pushed into the corner, I mean, on paper it might work, but if you're in that particular school that suddenly is looking because you think it's quick, you're probably going to shortchange the immediacy of the institution as well, whatever legacy you're bringing with you.
Yeah.
You're going to have to give up things at a quicker rate, simply because you're painted into a corner. So people think it's quick. People think it's easy because we're independent schools. We're not subject to regulation. Well, guess what? Frequently we are subject to regulation when it comes to merger and acquisition. Again, not all states might require the state attorney general sign off, but there are plenty that do. And to get that in front of the attorney general's desk doesn't happen overnight. So, I mean, for you, those are probably the two that really rise to the top.
Yeah.
The other one I would say, and I'm going to articulate it, no one's ever articulated it this way, is that any two schools can come together. No, they can't. They cannot. You're not going to merge like a Waldorf school with a super techie school.
Right.
Philosophically, that just doesn't, it really doesn't fit. So it really is about, we talk about student voice and choice, right? And in instructional, on the instructional side of house. And it's kind of like that with schools. We've got to really think about voice and choice for where's the best match. It
Yeah.
takes time.
Does take time. Last question that I have for you, and that really comes down to how does a school pressure test whether a merger is the right solution? I mean, I guess at the end of the day, they've got to find a solution to a problem, but have they identified the problem?
Bingo. That's it. What is the actual problem you're trying to solve? I think sometimes schools might break out the word merger a little too quickly, because they need to better frame what the actual problem to be solved is. And then once they understand the nature of that problem, explore alternatives. So whether that's shared services, or is it a couple of donors who would love to see the school do well, but are exhausted, not just fatigued, exhausted by plugging the holes. They'd be willing to fund a business turnaround plan over X amount of time. However you try to solve it, I would say identify the hopefully 2 to 5 different ways you might solve it. One of those might be merger, but sequentially it doesn't need to be number one. Make sure that you've thoroughly explored those other options first. But what's causing the problem? I mean, is it truly finances? When you mentioned Michael Horn a short while ago, there's a great article out there that he and a colleague co-authored on an updated metric called the baseline staying power of a school. And there's a good article on this, on educationnext.org. They looked at it through the lens of higher education, but it's a pretty simple formula, and it's about cash divided by net cash flow. I'm oversimplifying, but that's it. It's not actually a complex formula. And then if you have that number, that'll tell you how much time you have before you'd really have to draw down on reserves or endowment. And then you can just map it out and say, okay, in how many years would we do this? So I think boards need to do that exercise as part of this figuring out the problem. So they literally know how much runway they have left. I think
That's
Horn and colleagues said it's about a 75 to 80% accuracy rate. They looked at 20 or 25 Northeastern colleges. That's a really high accuracy rate for this kind of thing.
yeah,
So
that's
I'd
great.
recommend it.
That is awesome advice. Um, Kevin, if somebody wants to reach out to follow up, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure. Feel free to email me. It's very simple. It's my first initial and last name. So kruth at njais.org. Always happy to have
Awesome.
a conversation.
Fantastic. Kevin Ruth, Executive Director of the New Jersey Association of Independent Schools. Thank you so much. This has been such an education for me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. This was fun. Thanks.
Yeah. And if you're a member of Moonshot Lab, hang tight. The extended version for you is coming up next. But Kevin, thanks again. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.